So because I was going to do transactional analysis, I've been listening to transactions a lot for the last few months. And I'm just aware that every time somebody says something, it's a stimulus and then how you're going to respond. And I hope that you go from here doing that same thing, and you're probably doing it already. Whether you're redefining, whether you're responding, whether you're blocking. We're going to give you an opportunity to come up with examples of transactions that are problems, and then and give you an opportunity to explore what options there might be in terms of response to that. And let's see where you get with that, and then we'll continue that conversation after we do the exercise.
Sometimes I'm going to use the words critical parent and nurturing parent. That makes me feel like critical must be always negative and nurturing must be always positive, and I think that's not true, and I wondered if you would speak to that. Like nurturing can also not be
Oh, thank you very much.
healthy.
There very often the functional diagram is diagram with the critical parent having a plus and a minus, and the nurturing parent having a plus and a minus, because nurturing can be a unhealthy rescuing, and that's a negative use of the nurturing parent. A healthy use of the nurturing parent is to be empathic and to say, I hear you and that must be hard for you. Healthy use of the critical parent, the plus of the critical parent is the examples that we're being given here about setting boundaries and saying you're not to talk like that, or I don't believe that way, or whatever you're not to speak to me like that. An unhealthy way or a negative way of using the critical parent is to label, criticize. You're always doing that. You've just never been you just always lying to me or whatever. Be aware, be careful of the word use, you. And in visions, we always invite people into we say I. Yeah. Thank you for asking that.
Felipe, I thought of Teddy Kennedy. This is not quite relevant to what you're saying, but still it's kind of interesting just for you to reflect about, for all of us to reflect about, how would you interpret this? He was saying question and answer period, and some guy in the audience shouted at him, I have a right to speak, and meaning to Kennedy. And Teddy said, and I have a right not to listen.
Okay, we're going to move into an exercise. Think of a recent experience you had where you felt uncomfortable. It felt like, this doesn't feel too good. It may have been today, or maybe that it's at your workplace or your home place, or the ones that you were talking about may be one of those examples. And then, what was the stimulus? What was your response? What ego states might be at play? And how did you end up feeling? We're going to use this exercise again later when we talk about strokes and games, but it'll give you an opportunity to begin to look at transactions. And then the most important one is what could you have done differently? And this is where you can consider the options. So it's an invitation for you to think about something that actually happened. It's so important, you've said it twice before, and I'm going to say it again. It's so important to talk about examples. When people are talking about theory, it's like, give me an example so that we can talk about. And this is an invitation for you to think about an example to apply the theory. So will you do that for a minute, and then do it, and then I'll give you the further instructions.
You say do it, you mean self or with a partner?
By yourself first, so that you can then, and then you're going to share. I'll give you that instruction. So you're going to pick somebody to share it with, and maybe give options and learn from each other. And you can decide whether you want to go with somebody you haven't met yet, that you'd like to meet and talk with, or somebody that you already had talked to. Who would like to share some examples of a transaction that was uncomfortable, that you did some learning about and explored some options in terms of how to responding?
So the story is my mother's dog passed away. So my response was to be the critical parent and getting very, very upset. You're calling me about the dog. There are people starving in the street. So I was very frustrated. I was very unhappy about the whole thing. And how I felt. What I could have done differently, I could have done the nurturing parent and say things like, it must have been hard for you to have to bury the dog after 10 years to keep you company. And you're probably feeling sad about that, and you don't know how to express it, therefore, that's why you're yelling at me. Things like that.
That's a nice option.
What was that? Okay, so I went through my stuff in life and never got so much support from my family or so much communication from my family as when the dog passed away.
Wow.
So,
Thank you. That's,
you're welcome.
yeah. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Options work. And when you were thinking about options is like, it's good to take a pause before we respond. Or notice how we're responding and then take a pause and think about what are the options.
I don't know. I guess I could have like asked her about something fun, more fun. I could have changed the subject
You
and
could've.
just been like, how's teaching aqua aerobics lately or
That's
something.
right.
I don't
Anyway,
know.
that's a really good example about the employing options to response. And
Yeah, I was performing at a block party. 20 people followed me on Instagram after I performed.
that's a good natural child response.
Yeah, sharing the joy of what I'm doing. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
that's
true.
good.
That's
good,
true.
Sharon. And before the question, I just wanted to make a point that the nice thing about options and the example that you were giving is we can always come back with options. If we have an immediate stimulus response and it's an adapted child, we can always come back later and say, Mother, I'm sorry I replied this. I mean, your mother crossed the transaction and changed the conversation. But we can always come back and say, I'm sorry for that. You know, what I wanted to share is, that's a nice thing about options.
Right.
Thank you.
Well, I just wondered if maybe this is a good time to talk a little bit about the characteristics of a stimulus, like, because that happens so often that the stimulus gets shifted from one person who said something, and then the other person goes in the mode of reacting. So they're in their place, and the initial stimulus is still in their place.
Absolutely.
So can you just say a little bit more about how we, I guess, maintain that focus on because it requires a lot of self-regulation, obviously, and management of your own emotions, not getting triggered by what the person initially said.
It requires listening closely. It requires listening, and then, because I think this was a perfect example, both of these examples here, because the response was to the stimulus. Yes?
Do we have time for me to share something that I could use some feedback on regarding this?
You have 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay.
No, you have a minute, and I have another one.
Okay. Pressure. All right. So I'm at the tail end of a 7-year engagement. And the immediate stimulus is we are no longer living together. I'm in the house that we bought together. He lives somewhere, I don't even know where, has all the assets that we own together, and my dog, and has had her since November. Our conversations are always via email because he will not interact with me in person. And I'm trying to separate and move on. And I can't get anywhere with it because he will only do his life his way and interact with me in his way and no other way. And when I say, I'd like my dog back and then we can move forward, it gets met with, well, I'll pay you for her. It just is impossible.
You see, you had transactional analysis. That was the transaction. I want my dog back. I'll pay you for it. That was the redefinition. You change the subject from you want the dog back to I'll pay you for it. So that one's one. But I also heard you say that you're trying to change the dynamic.
I'm trying to split.
Yeah, and The exercise that we're working on right now is transactions, just stimulus and response.
Okay.
And you're dealing with a series of stimulus and responses that have been ongoing. And we might want to consider that more in terms of games, when we get to games.
Okay.
Which are more complex and a series of transactions, I think,
Okay,
if that's okay.
yeah,
We'll remind us to bring it back when we're talking about games.
okay.
But when you talk about one, like for instance, I won my dog back, that's a very clear stimulus transaction. And he responds by saying, I'm willing to buy it from you. And so you don't want, no, that's a changing of the subject. It's not about you wanting the dog back, but it's not changing the subject, but it's changing, that's not what, I'm telling you, I don't want to sell it, you know. So you are at an impasse.
I had a moment when I was thinking about my example that as I tried to analyze it and I tried to think of my transactions in ego states, that I didn't necessarily always feel like critical parent or parent was involved or child. In fact, if anything, the stimulus and the way I responded had to do with my past. Yes, it had to do with like feelings that came up of like when I was in middle school or something, like those things that bring me back and regress back to like how it was I was treated and excluded in middle school, or how I was invisible or not, you know, validated in my existence. So yeah, I don't know. In that kind of transaction, I don't even know how to go back to it being about parent and child.
Well, it's
You know
enough
what I
that you
mean?
went where you went and analyzed. In TA, that's called a rubber band experience, where it takes you back to an earlier period. Van had talked about that a little earlier. And we will talk more about that when we talk about strokes next, in terms of ego, rather than ego states, because what you were talking about is a type of stroke that you used to experience in the past, which this one reenacted for you and brought you back into that rubber band experience, which takes you back to that place. But I understand why the ego state that I hear involved was a child ego state. Your child get triggered. Yeah.
It's become clear to me that I'm really good at setting boundaries when it comes to thinking about problematic relationships or transactions with individual people. And this exercise has helped me realize I want to protect my nurturing parent as I set boundaries. The nurturing, for me, that it's okay for me to do that, and that I'm still okay as I set these boundaries, because I'm a very accommodating person, and that's just my character. It's just my father complained about it years ago. So it's just really a learning.
That's a great, useful learning, very useful learning. And it reminds me to re-emphasize again what I said at the beginning about when we want to, in terms of using options, is we want to reestablish that I'm okay, you're okay. How can we reply, how can we use an option that continues to reflect my okayness and your okayness? I think that that's the rule, the basis, the foundation by which we choose options. Which, what you were saying reminded me, is like maybe this would be more useful in terms of reassuring the other person's okayness as well as mine. The boundary setting is me, the nurturing part is you. Reinstating our okayness.